Okay, so without further ado, let me turn it over to our first speaker, who is Nageeb Ali from Penn State.
Great. Thanks so much, Marina and Naveen and others for organizing this terrific conference. And thanks so much to the many of you tuning in. So this is joint work with Eyal Chen-Zion and Eric Lilithun. This is what they look like. You'll see Eric on the gallery view here. He's here as well, answering questions. Eyal unfortunately couldn't make it. Eyal's at Amazon and Eric is at Colgate. And so let me say what the three of us are thinking about. So Ken Arrow, when thinking about markets for information, outlined two issues that exist when selling information. The first issue is one that you might think of as a verifiability problem, which is how do I convince you that I have something useful to share with you without revealing it ahead of time? And so therein lies a commitment problem that once you pay me, I might take your money and run, or once I give you the information, you might take my information and run. So that's one commitment problem he hinted at. The other commitment problem Ken Arrow hinted at was the issue of resale. That once I've given information to someone, information is something that's replicable. It's something that I can consume and retrade myself. And there's a question about how would resale impact the pricing of information. Now, there are lots of different models to try to understand this. This is sort of obviously relates to understanding the importance of intellectual property rights. And some models hint to the importance of bargaining power of the original monopolist of information, so on and so forth. So what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to exposit a model of decentralized bargaining, where there's someone who's going to have information to sell. And we're going to see in this model of decentralized bargaining, what happens to the price of information. Okay, so this is, so here's the outline for the talk. I'm going to present to you in some ways the problem. I'm going to tell you about a solution, and then we're going to discuss it. And you know, after a whole week of sort of very excellent game theory talks, you know, I thought we would, I would give a talk that's mostly set in example land, where this is just going to be some simple illustrations that are going to bring out the sort of the key incentives and leave the more general analysis for you to see in the paper. So here's the example land we're going to live in. There's a seller who is trading with two buyers. And I'm going to begin with a benchmark where there is no resale possibility. The seller has some information. I want you to think of this information as either some knowledge of some underlying state of the world that the buyers are going to take an action dependent upon. Maybe the seller's information you want to think of as expertise and knowing how to use some technology, just some general skills that the seller can sell. Each buyer's value for those skills is 1. And when the buyer has this information, they're going to get a stock payoff of 1 and a payoff of 0 until then. And this is how trading is going to occur. So I've got two trading links in this world without resale. Each link is going to meet with probability lambda dt in a period of length dt. And when the party to a link meet, they can possibly trade on it. Each player is going to discount the future at rate R. And one term you're going to see come up often again is lambda divided by R, which I want you to think of as the frequency of interaction per unit of effective time. Okay? So how's this model going to work? We're going to have a model that involves some dynamics and Nash bargaining. So in this vanilla example, without resale, each buyer can obtain information only from the seller. And an equilibrium is going to correspond to a case where players have rational expectations of what's going to happen in the future. And when they're thinking about their continuation values from trading or not trading, and they're going to do Nash bargaining with respect to that. So what is an equilibrium price going to solve? An equilibrium price when a seller and a buyer meet is, this is going to be, for the purposes of the talk, symmetric Nash bargaining. We're going to equate the seller's gain from selling today with the buyer's gain from buying today. So the seller, if she sells today at a price of P, she gets P today, versus waiting for the next trading opportunity with this buyer, which she will get a P in the future. If the buyer buys the information today, he gets the value of that information minus the price he pays. And if he doesn't do this today, well, then he has to wait for the next time that he meets the seller and he can do this. where e to the minus RT is, of course, the discount factor, and e to the minus lambda T lambda captures how long the, the expected arrival of the next meeting with the seller. Good. So, solve this. This is sort of very not unexpected. They're going to, the price of information is going to be a half. And so without resale possibilities, if we were to prohibit resale, the buyers and the seller split the surplus. The seller gets half the social surplus in the setting. Okay, so this is the benchmark. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to augment this benchmark with resale possibilities. Any questions so far? None? Okay, excellent. So here is what's going to happen with resale. So now you see that I've added a link between buyer B1 and B2, so that once the buyer obtains information, he can turn around. He can consume the information and he can turn around and sell it to the other buyer at the next trading opportunity. And this is capturing the replicability of information. So here's how we're going to study this problem. So we're living in a setting in which the identity of those who have information is publicly observed. So you want to think about this as being a system that has 4 possible states. Either the seller is the only one with information, or it's seller and buyer B1, seller and buyer B2, or seller and both the buyers, in which case the game in some way, the game is terminated. And what an equilibrium is going to be is it's going to be a value function that's associated with being in one of these 4 states, and the prices at which trade would occur in one of these states. Given prices, we're going to assume that value functions satisfy rational expectations, that everyone knows how things are going to evolve. And prices are going to satisfy symmetric Nash bargaining given the value functions, which means 2 things. First, a pair of players, one who has information and one who doesn't have information, are going to trade if and only if trading today increases their joint bilateral surplus. And 2, the prices at which they trade are going to split the gains from trade equally. So this is a very sort of standard kind of way of modeling it. We see this kinds of modeling done in the macro search literature, say. Cool. And what I'm going to show is that this plain, simple vanilla model is going to have multiple equilibria. There's going to be an immediate agreement equilibrium. And in this immediate agreement equilibrium, we're going to see the implications of this. And there's going to be a seller optimal equilibrium. And the fact that I'm distinguishing these 2 tells you that in this model, the seller is going to benefit from using delay. So let me start off with the immediate agreement equilibrium. And we're going to proceed by backward induction. Suppose we're living in a state in which the seller has information, knows omega or has this expertise, and buyer B1 has information. And now buyer B2 can buy information from either the seller or buyer B1. So buyer B2 has 2 trading partners. And now what are going to be the equilibrium prices at which the second buyer is buying information? Whoever they're buying that information from, that person, if that person can trade today, they can sell it at a price of P, or they could potentially sell it tomorrow if it's the case that this one remaining buyer is still around as a buyer in the future, the next time they meet. There's a chance that buyer B2 would have already met buyer B1 by the time they meet again, in which case the seller won't be able to sell to buyer B2. So this is what's being captured here by the e to the minus 2 lambda t. You can sell to buyer B2 if it's the case that buyer B2 has not met anyone by the time the seller meets buyer B2. What's buyer B2's gain from trading today? He says, oh, I can buy the information today, or I can buy the information at my next trading opportunity with either one of these 2 characters. Okay? And here, this sort of drives a wedge between them, so that if we were to just mechanically solve this, we see that the price that buyer B2 pays is R divided by 2R plus lambda, which converges to 0 in a frictionless market if there are many trading opportunities per unit of effective time. All right. Let me just sort of make a small sort of remark. The key idea here is that for the buyer, the gain from trading today is simply the cost of delay. And as we're going to a frictionless market, that cost of delay is converging to zero. For a seller, if I had strictly positive prices and prices bounded away from zero, there's a strictly positive gain from trading today because she may lose the buyer to the other seller. Equating these two gains for these two to be equal imply that prices must vanish. Now, there's a question about whether you find this intuitive or not. On the one hand, you'd say, yes, of course, there's a single buyer, there are two sellers. There's like a Bertrand outcome that emerges. You might say, no, it's not necessarily intuitive because, of course, buyer B2 isn't meeting both players simultaneously. They're only meeting them one at a time. They're facing some slight cost of delay. And so we often think about whether the diamond paradox may or may not apply in terms of whether prices are competitive or go towards the monopolistic pricing. And here, this is just the observation that in these models, slight bargaining power to the buyer, here I've got symmetric bargaining power, slight bargaining power to the buyer just averts the diamond paradox. That's what's going on here, just explaining what's happening. Okay, so we're still continuing with, going from the subgame. So this is the world in which, I just solved a world in which there was only one remaining buyer. How does this influence incentives earlier? Suppose we had two uninformed buyers. And for the rest of the talk, this factor gamma is going to be a very important factor that it's going to show up in a lot of equations. So let me spend a minute explaining it. So I don't have, if any of you have a good mathematical term to describe this factor, we'd love to hear it. For the purposes of the talk, let me call this gamma the Yawn factor, which is, suppose that Marina and Naveen are going to yawn at sort of exponential arrival times. And I'm going to get $1 if Marina is the first person who sort of next yawns after this time, okay? And now there's a question, how would I value getting that $1? Well, that would be this yawn factor gamma, which is I have to wait for the time at which Marina yawns. Has to be that between now and then, neither Marina nor Naveen has yawned. And this is the density at which Marina yawns, okay? And this, of course, this yawn factor converges to a half in the frequent offers limit. So this term is going to show up in our expressions. Now, suppose the seller meets a buyer. Both buyers are uninformed at this stage. And the buyer's payoff is the buyer can buy the information today, in which case they pay the price of the first buyer. And then if they can meet the second buyer first, they're able to resell that information successfully. Or, this is in an immediate agreement equilibrium, the seller says, hey, maybe, if I wait, the same thing is going to happen in the future. I'm the first person who meets the seller again. So if we disagree today, we come back to, it's like Groundhog Day. We come back to exactly today. Or we come to an alternative future where the other buyer meets the seller first. Now there are going to be two sellers of information, and I'm going to be the only buyer of information. I wait to meet one of them, and then of course I can buy information at the price that the second buyer faces. Now we know that as we're approaching the frequent offer limit, the price that the second buyer faces is converging to zero. And so these two expressions converge to what you see on the slides. And now we see that if it's the case that I have to pay a price that's bounded away from zero for being the first buyer of information, I'd rather not do it. Waiting is more profitable. And so it has to be the case that in the frequent offer limit, for me to be willing to buy, the price even I face converges to zero. Okay. Questions here? Okay, so here's the seller here is a monopolist on information. The issue that we're facing is that neither he nor the first buyer can commit to not selling information to the second buyer. So the second buyer is getting information for virtually free because both of them are going to be off to the races competing to try to make that sale. Given that this is the case, there's little incentive for anyone to buy information first. The resale price is low, and waiting to be the second buyer involves minimal delay. And so that's why we see in the immediate agreement equilibrium, the seller, despite being a monopolist, because of the resale issue and the commitment problems inherent to it, the seller cannot capture any surplus.
Nageeb, can I bring a question to you from the Q&A? Eric is probably trying to answer it, but I think it might be useful to bring it to you. So Heskey asked a clarification about, are the meetings publicly observed? Specifically, the second buyer knows that the first is already purchased, even if she doesn't know what it is that the buyer bought.
Oh, good, good, good. So here there's like a single information good. So if the trade happens, you know exactly what has been traded. What's publicly observed at every stage, and this was in the sort of the state space description, is who has the good. So if it's just the seller who has the good, or if the seller and the buyer has the good. So not only are, you could think of this as links are, the meetings are publicly observed, but also the trading decisions are publicly observed. Yeah, cool. Okay. So now let me talk about the seller optimal equilibrium. And here, the seller optimal equilibrium is going to involve delayed agreements. And this is what the structure, this is one potential, this is one such equilibrium. The seller says, look, I'm never going to sell information to buyer B2 before I sell information to buyer B1. Once I sell information to buyer B1, then we're going to do whatever was that sub-game from the immediate agreement equilibrium, where we both are going to compete to sell it to buyer B2. But prior to that sale from buyer B1, I'm never going to sell information first to buyer B2, okay? So in this equilibrium, every time seller and buyer B2 meet, they're not going to trade unless it's the case that buyer B1 has already bought information. And now buyer B1 knows that he's always the first buyer. There's no way for him to get information from any other source. And so he's going to pay a price that converges to a half. Actually, I think he's going to pay a price equal to a half, regardless of whether you're at the frequent offers limit or not. Okay, so this is what the first buyer is going to do, because the only way the buyer can get information is from the seller, and this corresponds to the equation we first wrote without resale possibilities. We still need to prove that it's credible for the seller and buyer B2 to not trade. When is it credible for them to not trade? If their joint surplus from disagreement exceeds their joint surplus from trading. Okay, so what I've written here is their joint surplus from disagreement and their joint surplus from trade. If they trade, they get a joint, the joint surplus corresponds to the value of information, which is 1. And then of course, each of them has an opportunity to sell this information to buyer B1. Or if they don't trade, the seller expects, if I wait for buyer B1, I'm going to be able to milk buyer B1 for some, money here. And then we're going to compete in selling. I'm going to get some value from potentially selling this information to buyer B2. Buyer B2 himself says, look, if I wait, I'm going to be able to buy this information for super cheap. And so given that the seller can sort of get some money by waiting from selling it to buyer B1, and buyer B2 by waiting can get information for super cheap, if we have frequent enough trading opportunities, then the joint surplus from disagreement exceeds the joint surplus from agreement. And so we see here, we've got in some ways, a complete information model in which the seller benefits from delaying trading with one buyer because of the resale possibilities. All right. So the seller optimal equilibrium features some delay. You might say this isn't so bad if I just have facing 2 buyers. I'm getting it, the seller's getting some surplus from one buyer. But the general model is going to have n buyers. And what this result would imply is that the seller can obtain the bilateral bargaining price from at most 1 buyer in any equilibrium. And after that, all the prices are going to converge to 0. So from one perspective, this is actually somewhat of starkly showing how with resale possibilities, the monopolist on information cannot capture very much. So clearly you could do better than this if you can somehow prohibit resale, but what we're going to look for now are some non-contractual solutions. So this was the sort of highlighting the problem, and now I'm going to go into thinking about a non-contractual solution to this, unless there are questions. Okay, so let's go into a solution. And to go into a solution, I'm going to do a brief interlude to sort of highlight some of the key features of this model and that sort of help us understand the solution. Say it's the case that information weren't replicable, that you could either choose to consume it or you can sell it. You can't do both. So what I always think of this is like the seller has like a rare copy of a Led Zeppelin LP that just cannot be resold or reproduced. There's only a single copy of this good. It's a value 1, one means like 1 million to each buyer. And a buyer who possesses it can either keep it or resell it. Okay, this actually is a rare Led Zeppelin LP. It's a promotional LP that was, they were only made one copy of this and it was never released to the market. Okay, so what happens here? So once a buyer obtains the good, given that buyers have identical values, there's no reason to retrade. And so now the equilibrium prices have to solve this trade-off where the seller's gain from trading today is simply the price she gets from trading today versus waiting for the next trading opportunity. The buyer's gain from trading today, the buyer's gain from trading today is being able to get this rare Led Zeppelin LP versus worrying that if he waits around for the future, it might be sold to the other buyer first. So in some ways, because here the good is not replicable, the seller's on the short side of the market, and now market competition implies that the seller is actually going to be able to obtain the entire surplus. All right, so we're going to get around the problem I hinted at earlier by creating a non-replicable sort of item within their trading relations. And this is the following non-replicable item. What if what the seller could sell is the right to be the second buyer? What do I mean by this? There's a single token that she's going to sell to either buyer. Whoever gets it first gets that token. And if buyer BI buys the token, then the seller always sells information first to the other buyer. So the token is really conferring the right to be the second buyer of information who we know buys information at approximately 0. So what's the value of this token? The value of this token is it lets you, it's an opt-out. It lets you opt out of being the first buyer of information. We saw that in the seller optimal equilibrium, the first buyer of information always has to buy for approximately a half. The second buyer of information buys at approximately 0. So if I can buy that token, that means that the seller is always going to sell information first to the other buyer, in which case I am saving 1/2. Okay? The issue is that there are fewer tokens than there are buyers. So just like the rare Led Zeppelin LP, this token is rare, relatively rare. And so the seller now is going to be able to capture the full value of the token. So she obtains 1/2 approximately for the token and 1/2 for the information, which is exactly what she could get with full intellectual property protection. And this is without any commitment or any kinds of regulation. All right. So you might say this was kind of a little bit of a sweeping intuition. Let me give you some, algebra to tell you that we're not sweeping anything under the rug. Suppose it's the case that the price of the token were PT. And now what's the value of buying the token today is I paid a price today. And then at some point in the future, the seller is going to sell information to the other buyer. At which point, I can buy information from either of these two people who now have information at a price that I pay when there's only one buyer left who wants to buy information. Okay. Now we know that as we approach the frequent offers limit, the price I expect to pay for information is converging to 0. So really the only thing I'm incurring is the price I'm paying for the token. Now, the seller has not sold a token. I meet the seller, and the seller and I are thinking about how to bargain over this token. And if we're doing symmetric Nash bargaining, which just again for the slides, The seller's gain from selling the token has to equal the buyer's gain from buying the token. And what is the seller's gain from selling the token today? She can say, look, you know, I can sort of start us on this path. I sell the token today, then tomorrow I sell information to one person, and then with some chance I get to sell information to the other person. And either we start this process today, or we wait for the next time to start this process. Okay, so it's either I'm going to get this payoff whenever we start this process, and my gain is just really the cost of delaying this process. You know, what's the buyer's value from buying the token today? They get the value from buying the token today, or two things could happen in the future. Either the next time the buyer meets the seller, it's like Groundhog Day, we're exactly in the same scenario. Or it's the case that by the next time this buyer meets the seller has already sold the token to the other buyer, in which case I have to be the first buyer of information. Okay. So if we go to the frequent offers limit, the seller's gain from selling the token today, that's converging to 0. And so now the buyer's gain from buying information today is simply going to be sort of this gap between, do I want to be a token buyer, a buyer of a token, or do I want to be an information buyer? Okay. And if the seller's gain is converging to 0, equating these two means that the buyer's gain has to be converging to 0, which means that the price that the buyer pays for the token has to be converging to the same price that they were paying for information. Any questions about this? Okay, so here's, you know, I sort of introduced thinking about these tokens in some ways as an object, but, you know, tokens need not be physical. One way to think about what we're doing here is that the previous problem hinted at issues that you face if you look at a Markov perfect equilibrium, where the state space is defined as the set of players who already have information. What tokens are doing here is they're encoding some minimal degree of history dependence, where trading and agreement decisions are going to condition on whether the token has been sold or not. The scheme that we have is, all that it's doing is it's exploiting the inherent competitive forces within bargaining and resale. It exploits both the competitive forces. The reason the buyer is willing to pay so much for this token is because A, the tokens are scarce, and because the buyer knows he can buy information for a very low price later. So in some ways, I hinted at the resale problem being a problem, but within that problem is in some ways the seed of its own solution, of being able to exploit it, to being able to solve it. Okay. This is a particular scheme of solving it. You could have other schemes. So we actually came across a token scheme by first writing down a scheme where information was encrypted, was sliced into different bits, and then in each bit was sold separately. And then we later realized that you don't even need to slice it. You could just sort of create these tokens. But there are lots of different ways in which you could implement something like a prepay scheme. And one of those would involve giving very noisy or encrypted information to each buyer that they have to combine. In some ways, I'm selling an encrypted copy of the information to Naveen, and I'm selling to Marina the keys to that encryption. That would be another way of implementing this. All right, so I don't know how much time I have. Yeah.
Quick question. So what stops this buyer from offering instead to pay exactly the same price that you were also offering to pay for token, but rather for information? So why do you sort of go through this extra transaction of token, right? I mean, what stops me as a buyer from saying, oh, I'm willing to pay for information what I would be willing to pay for token? This is kind of like a negotiation. Yeah. So would it not collapse the, yeah.
So if the buyer could try to pay more to get information rather than the token, the seller would not be willing to accept it, because the seller would say, look, if I just delay and sell the token first to the other buyer and then sell information to you, I'm going to get 1/2 from each of you. So I'm getting a total of 1. I'm expecting to get a payoff of 1. Whereas this buyer isn't going to be willing to pay much more than 1/2. And so for the seller as well, the joint surplus, when the seller meets the first buyer, their joint surplus for disagreement on information, trading information, exceeds their joint surplus from agreeing to trade information, but their joint surplus from agreeing to trade a token exceeds the joint surplus from disagreeing to trade a token. So we do check that condition.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. So now I'm not sure how much time I have.
Time-wise, you're doing fairly well. So
Okay.
you know, with
Cool.
discussion, we end in 14 minutes. So you know, you could speak for another 9 minutes or so, and leave 5
Okay.
minutes for discussion if you'd like.
Okay, excellent, excellent. I don't think I need to speak for 9 minutes. So I'll tell you what the general model does. So the general model is going to allow for a general set of buyers and sellers. All of whom are going to be connected by a complete graph. The bargaining weights need not be symmetric across trading roles, but the only thing that we require is that the seller doesn't have full bargaining power. So the seller could have a lot of bargaining power, but the bargaining weight on the seller can't be 1. And the key step in a lot of what we do is showing that the price of information converges to 0 as soon as 2 players have information in this general model. And so in a Markov perfect equilibrium, the only way for the seller to obtain surplus is on the first buyer before she has sold information. That's what generates the seller optimal equilibrium. On the other hand, if the seller is a monopolist, so our general model allows for multiple buyers and multiple sellers, but if the seller is a monopolist, then she can obtain the full intellectual property value for information using a token scheme where with n buyers, you create n-1 tokens. And from each of those n-1 tokens, the seller is going to be able to get a price that's approximately equal to, you know, in the symmetric bargaining world, 1/2. So that's how the insights of the paper, in some ways, they generalize. You've seen it in the example, and I'm not going to say the general analysis is as easy as the example, but a lot of the economic logic remains identical. Okay, so let me wrap up with some ways telling you where we were coming from. So this is clearly relevant for thinking about trading for information and markets for information. We actually somewhat came at this from thinking about non-markets for information, thinking about social learning, and thinking about whether sometimes some of the inefficiencies in social learning could be corrected if people were just able to sell expertise and information and knowledge to others. One thing that you have as soon as you're able to sell information is that information is still non-rivalrous in consumption, as we sort of see in this model, but it is an excludable good because you can't exclude from it. And really the challenge of the pricing in markets for information isn't coming out from the lack of excludability, even if I could exclude problems. The challenge really is coming from commitment problems, where once I've sold information, buyers who bought information cannot commit to reselling it themselves. And once I've sold information to one person, you know, you might you're still tempted to sell it to others. Okay. And what we've done is we're showing that this commitment problem can be exploited to help resolve it. Okay. So that's the sort of the wrap up. So let me just say a few words now about what the literature has done before this point. So Arrow, as I said, of course, hinted at this problem. A couple of papers have studied the verifiability problem prominently. Anton and Yao, as well as Horner and Skripach, have studied the verifiability problem with information sale. The resale problem with information sale was first looked at in a model of decentralized bargaining by Polanski, in which what he does is he looks at a model in which there are no delays. There's no discounting, a model in which there's no discounting whatsoever. And he solves for the immediate agreement equilibria of such models and characterizes in terms of a sort of a system of equations what those payoffs have to look like. This is a model that's been subsequently explored by Mihai, who gives a very nice closed form characterization of these payoffs. And what Mihai's characterization emphasizes is the importance in a general graph of having bottleneck links. Links that sort of those are the only way in which information could pass is through those bottlenecks. One of the real challenges that exists in these models more generally is really showing even the existence of an equilibrium. This has been a major difficulty, I think, for these papers as well as ours. And in our case, what we are able to leverage is the fact that we're looking at a complete graph. This simplifies our problem tremendously. And in looking at a complete graph, we're able to sort of shed light both on the seller optimal equilibria as well as this token scheme. Okay, so that's all I have, and happy to take questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nageeb. So there is, I have a question of my own, but let me first refer one from Heskey again from the Q&A. So you might want to look at this yourself if you have access to it, because it's got a few sentences.
Yeah, I see it.
But I'll read it anyway. So he says, you're overcoming a commitment problem, but the token has inherent in it some commitment. This is clever, but if I sell something encrypted you can't open, you really have to believe that there's something in there. I guess with information, this is a problem in general. Did I tell you everything I have to say? What stops me from selling it to you, but then actually saying I have more to say?
Great. Yeah. So okay. So one of the things we did think about when so here we've got a token scheme where the token itself is completely uninformative. And one of the things we did worry about is sort of the if I were to slice information and sort of try to renege on, you know, selling some of those slices or slicing it more finely than others. I'll say that the model in some ways is ill-suited to asking these questions because we don't have a full-on non-cooperative game that describes the seller's actions. So that's one response. The other response I would say is that within the confines of the model that we have, there's some property that's analogous to, similar to like one-shot deviation kinds of arguments we use generally in dynamic games, where if the seller were to deviate at this one place, the buyer is going to believe that the seller is not going to deviate in this way in the future. Given that waiting is infinitesimally costly, they're just willing to wait. And so that's why these schemes within the confines of the model we've written down don't seem to be an issue. Yeah. Great question.
Okay. There's a question from Teddy Mekanen. So Teddy, if you want to unmute yourself, please.
Sure, thank you. Nageeb, you said that the seller, when you have multiple buyers, and buyers more than just two, that the seller is only doing this kind of bilateral selling with only one person, and after that you kind of go into the full competition across all the different buyers, right?
That's right.
Is that assuming that the buyers can't also do the same kind of bilateral selling with other subsequent buyers, or is that not optimal for the buyers to do that?
Excellent. So one thing that we show is, so in a world without tokens, so if you think about these kinds of Markov perfect equilibria, in the world without tokens, we have an inductive argument that shows that after the seller has sold information to the first buyer, regardless of what they might try to do, so we don't characterize exactly what happens in the equilibrium, regardless of what they might try to do, the price of information has to converge to zero. So in particular, we do look at the potential for schemes in which somehow the seller and the buyer try to create this self-enforcing scheme where they don't compete with each other on other buyers. And we show that all such schemes in some ways must break down or must lead to prices converging to zero.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I have a question. So I guess you sort of hinted at this, which is, so in a sense, I mean, one way of viewing the result is sort of emphasizing the importance of the Markov restriction, right?
Right.
So is there I mean, that's my intuition. Is that formally correct? So basically, if in the game without tokens, there is a non-Markov equilibrium that replicates what you get with tokens as a Markov equilibrium?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one way of thinking about it is the game with tokens and the game without tokens. In some ways, you could think of these as being the same game. And all that the token is doing is it's a way of encoding a different strategy within that game. So I'm not necessarily, one way of thinking about the tokens is really as a physical object, that the person is really encrypting information and reselling encrypted information to each other. But one way of thinking about the tokens is more of a symbolic object that describes how people expect to coordinate or condition their pricing and agreement decisions. I think Eric too, but at least I am agnostic about these two interpretations.
I think, I would say what adding the set of token holders to the state space is doing is it's allowing us to differentiate between histories where enough people have already paid something from histories where not enough people have yet paid something. And that's sort of the extra history dependence with the tokens.
Okay, thanks.
In some ways, I guess coming back to this, it's sort of, we try to emphasize in the paper this notion of prepaying for information as being a useful thing. And we can think of prepaying as really being encoding some small amount of history dependence.
But I don't think it is, I don't think you can construct an equilibrium that matches the outcome with tokens in the setting without tokens. Like when you're left with a single buyer, there is no way to get a positive price from that buyer if everyone can, if everyone has the information, can compete for that buyer. So.
But you're not, Miha, you're not selling information before you've sold tokens. So you sell all the N-1 tokens first, and then you make your first sale of information.
Right, but that changes the extensive form, like what histories are allowed to kind of arise, right, in the game without tokens.
I mean, I guess the way in which you could think of the tokens as two things. One is the extensive form in terms of this being traded, but also, I mean, I think what I take as to be Naveen's point is that you could just think of the history encoding whether a buyer, and I think this is Eric's point too, you could just think of the history encoding as to whether buyer I has already paid the seller or not. And if all the trading decisions are observed and those are things that can be conditioned on, it's still within the same original game. We've just enlarged what people can condition on in terms of their behavior.
But there is no way to construct an equilibrium of the game without tokens, even if you allow for normal curving behavior that would generate something, the token outcome.
I'm not sure that I understand.
You'll always, I mean, the last buyer will always.
Yeah, no,
free.
Well, I think there's, the question is, what is exactly the premise of the trade that's taking place, right? Why is it, in our model, the only thing that's being traded is the information good. So we don't have something in the model. That's true. We don't formally have something in the model without tokens that just allows the buyer to give some payment to the seller, and for that to be recorded as a part of the history. Is that along the right lines?
Yeah, I think that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay, so if there aren't any further questions, we are perfectly on time. So thank you again, Nageeb and Eric.